Joseph Smith gave prophetic license to the practice of women giving health blessings by the laying on of hands, using their faith as their authority. Do you see a time when this will be widely acknowledged in the church? Is anyone currently writing an Ensign article to this effect? Will this practice ever again be given license by the authorities of the church? Will this practice ever again be given license by the authorities of the church? That is certainly something I cannot answer. I think the publication of the first 50 years of Relief Society with abundant references to healing blessings is an indication that there is a coming acknowledgement that that was certainly part of women's lives in the 19th century, an important part. It was significant to them. They practiced it often, and the story of the diminishing of that practice is a very long and complicated story. I would refer you to the work by Jonathan Stapley and Christine Wright in the Journal of Mormon History for a careful examination of changes in that practice and ultimately the policy. I will say that in that day, we also have to look at the things that the practices that women were not involved in. They did not speak in sacrament meetings. They didn't have that preaching kind of opportunity, and they did not serve missions without their husbands. So it seems to me the responsibilities of women, as of men, vary in different ages. And Eliza Snow, for example, was accustomed to giving a blessing to women at the end of her addresses to Relief Society. It was a common part of what she did. And after she was set apart as general president by John Taylor, there was a lot of concern about invoking a blessing on women. That was something that she should not do. So even during her lifetime, that was questioned. And so it's interesting to see how she adjusted to that. She would say something like this: I would like to bless you, but under the circumstances, let me just say, I pray that the Lord will. It was a very lovely and beautiful way to continue what she'd been doing, but keeping as she always did within the order she so respected, and believed that by working within that order with respect and with faith, women would have great authority and power, and they did. Thank you.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism, the serial Mormon history podcast. What was the purpose of the Nauvoo Female Relief Society? This has been a hot subject of debate in Mormon historical studies for quite some time, and even at the inception of the Relief Society in 1842 and its resurrection in Utah in 1868, people weren't sure exactly what powers were right to be held by this female body. One thing is certain: whatever powers granted to the Relief Society, at the most progressive trajectory that hasn't even been realized to this day, it would be equal in power over Mormon women as the priesthood power has over men, but still reside under the umbrella of Mormon leadership that's 100% men. So right off the bat, the Relief Society can never be equal in power in any way, shape, or form because of this handicap. It will always answer to the brethren and never hold the executive powers the priesthood holds. And that's kind of the harsh reality here. If the Relief Society presidency has wanted to do anything throughout its entire history which conflicted with what the brethren wanted, that thing didn't happen. How much authority does a presidency of women have if they always have to answer to a higher presidency of men? But how was it initially organized? What was Joseph and Emma's initial intent in organizing the Female Relief Society? Dozens of quotes can be pulled from the prophet, and they seem contradictory to say the least. Today we're going to spend a bit of time going through an epistle that Joe wrote to the Relief Society, which was read in the last meeting of March 1842, the third gathering of the society. Before getting to that epistle, let's look at a bunch of quotes from Joseph Smith or other leaders in the Nauvoo Church to try and get a holistic understanding of what they viewed the purposes of the Relief Society to be. Where the arguments so often lie within the Relief Society and authority boils down to the question, did Joseph ordain the women with the priesthood? Was the Relief Society seen as a female priesthood body, and did they utilize the priesthood the ways that the elders did? And if they did have some kind of priestesshood authority, when was that taken away? Because it surely isn't practiced in the Brighamite tradition today. Here's a quote from the Book of the Law of the Lord, April 8th, 1842. And it's out of Joseph Smith's private journal. He says, quote, gave a lecture on the priesthood showing, how the sisters would come in possession of the privileges and blessings and gifts of the priesthood, and that the signs should follow them, such as healing the sick and casting out devils, end quote. Here's from Eliza R. Snow in the Relief Society Minute Book, quote, he, meaning Joseph Smith, proposed that the sisters elect a presiding officer to preside over them, and let that presiding officer choose 2 counselors to assist in the duties of her office, that he would ordain them to preside over the society, and let them preside just as the presidency preside over the church. If any officers are wanted to carry out the designs of the institution, let them be appointed and set apart as deacons, teachers, etc., end quote. Here's one from the Nauvoo Relief Society Minutes on March 30th, 1842, and this is on Joseph Smith papers, of course. Quote, the society should move according to the ancient priesthood, and that Joseph was, quote, going to make of the society a kingdom of priests as in Enoch's day, as in Paul's day, end quote. Here's another one from Eliza R. Snow in the Nauvoo Relief Society Minutes of April 28th, 1842. Joseph also said to the Relief Society, quote, the keys of the kingdom are about to be given to them that they may be able to detect everything false as well as to the elders. I now turn the key to, and 2 was changed to 4 by Willard Richards, I believe. I turn the key to you in the name of God, and this society shall rejoice, and knowledge and intelligence shall flow down from this time, end quote. Here's another one, and this is from a June 1868 communication to Stephen Post from Sidney Rigdon. Quote, Emma was the one to whom the female priesthood was first given, end quote. That's Sidney Rigdon. He was, acting president or, first counselor to Joseph Smith at the time. Here's from Bathsheba Smith. She was the 4th Relief Society president and wife of the first presidency member. She wrote, quote, I never like to hear a sermon without hearing something of the prophet Joseph Smith, for he gave us everything, every order of the priesthood. He said that he had given the sisters instructions that they could administer to the sick, and he wanted to make us, as the women were in Paul's day, a kingdom of priestesses, end quote. That was from June 9th, 1905. So you get the idea. Joseph and the early Mormon leaders can be quote mined all day to substantiate the claim that women were given the priesthood in Nauvoo. The resurrection of the Relief Society in Utah under Eliza R. Snow is wonderfully fascinating. Brigham Young commanded in 1867 that the Relief Societies should be started again as the local leadership saw fit. Eliza R. Snow went around the entire state for the next few years and established local relief societies. Snow taught the local women the purposes of the society, how to keep proper minute books, and then gave them access to all of the resources that only the Relief Society could attain. And a number of these minute books exist to this day in Eliza's remarkably beautiful handwriting. A few even list priesthood offices, like for the 14th Utah Ward, it says, quote, minutes of the meetings and recordings of the quorum of teachers of the Female Relief Society, end quote. And it also ordained some of the women as deaconesses. These are priesthood offices that are being ascribed to women within the Relief Society. I mean, dozens of data points can be used to claim that the early Mormon women had the power of the priesthood. If we consider how much healing they did, just healing alone, by administering to the sick and weary, it's arguable that the women in Utah exercised the priesthood more than the men. The men may come in and pronounce a healing blessing with anointing oil on somebody who is sick, but it was often the women of the Relief Society who were by the person's bedside for days nursing them back to health, where the real healing took place, including when they administered medicine infused with the topical consecrated anointing oil. If we're judging the presence of priesthood power based solely on the number of people who were healed when administered to, the women outranked the men, especially when it came to administering medical care to new mothers in early Utah. Otherwise, what testable priesthood power is there? The ability to make decisions? I mean, yeah, it turns out the men and women who are in positions of authority are equally capable of making executive decisions, but the church has simply never tried allowing women to have that specific part of priesthood authority. But where did Joseph Smith come down on the issue? Did women have the priesthood? That's where some interesting conversations can really kick off. Did Joseph ordain women to the priesthood? Did Bloody Brigham Young take that away in his Utah theocracy like he did with African Americans receiving the priesthood? Joe was such a progressive, right? And further, if not for priesthood ordination, what were some of the practical purposes of the Relief Society? Let's spend today reading through an epistle that Joe wrote to the Relief Society and see what can be garnered from his understanding of the role of the Relief Society and women in leadership positions in the Nauvoo Church. I'm reading this epistle from the Vogel History of the Church, Source and Text, Critical Edition 2015. It's volume 4, beginning on page 549. That's the entire epistle, but the Relief Society minutes taken by Secretary Eliza R. Snow for March 30th, 1842, they record the same epistle, but, it's just shorthand, and it's much harder to read. But, of course, the History of the Church version is much more lecture-like. It has the epistle in its entirety, so we're not going to be reading it from Eliza's minutes. It's from the History of the Church. So Joe's lecture was the first item of business when they opened the Relief Society meeting March 30th, 1842. We'll wrap up at the end of the episode with the remaining items of business just after they read the epistle, and I think that provides context for the epistle and the need of Joseph, creating this to lecture the women. Beginning, page 549 of the History of the Church, volume 4. The epistle is titled, Try the Spirits. Recent occurrences that have transpired amongst us render it an imperative duty devolving upon me to say something in relation to the spirits by which men are actuated. And men there in this is the royal men, as in all people. He kind of vacillates on the definition of men in this. It is evident from the apostles' writings that many false spirits existed in their day and had gone forth into the world, and that it needed intelligence, which God alone could impart, to detect false spirits, and to prove what spirits were of God. The world in general have been grossly ignorant in regard to this one thing, and why should they be otherwise? For no man knows the things of God but by the Spirit of God. After that, Joe goes on to provide his evidence for where people were able and unable to detect whether a spirit was of God or of the adversary. And you'll find that much of this entire epistle is constructed merely to cast aspersions at religions which aren't Mormonism, both ancient and contemporary. And of course, he starts with the Egyptians. Quote, The Egyptians were not able to discover the difference between the miracles of Moses and those of the magicians until they came to be tested together. And if Moses had not appeared in their midst, they would unquestionably have thought that the miracles of the magicians were performed through the mighty power of God, for they were great miracles that were performed by them. A supernatural agency was developed, and great power manifested. Of course, hearkening to the stories of Moses, commanding the plagues down and his staff turning into a snake and eating the snake's staves of the other magicians. That's apparently he was not using Moses was using the power of God, but the magicians, no, they did the same exact thing by the power of the devil. He goes on to say, The witch of Endor is no less singular a personage. Clothed with a powerful agency, she raised the prophet Samuel from his grave, and he appeared before the astonished king and revealed unto him his future destiny. Who is to tell whether this woman is of God and a righteous woman, or whether the power she possessed was of the devil, and her a witch, as represented by the Bible? It is easy for us to say now, but if we had lived in her day, which of us could have unraveled the mystery? It would have been equally as difficult for us to tell by what spirit the apostles prophesied, or by what power the apostles spoke and worked miracles. Who could have told whether the power of Simon the sorcerer was of God or of the devil? End quote. Now, it seems as if Joe is kind of misunderstanding the story of the witch of Endor. She was a conjurer of spirits, not a necromancer. But of course, Saul had outlawed witchcraft in Israel at this time in the Bible, so the woman was terrified that she would be imprisoned, and Saul was required to approach her in disguise to see the conjuration of his recently deceased Samuel. This is from 1 Samuel chapter 28, beginning on verse 3. Quote, "Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented over him and had buried him in Ramah, his hometown. In the meantime, Saul had removed the mediums and magicians from the land. The Philistines assembled. They came and camped at Shunem. Saul mustered all Israel and camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was absolutely terrified. So Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him, not by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by the prophets. So Saul instructed his servants, 'Find me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her.' His servants replied to him, 'There is a woman who is a medium in Endor.' So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothing and left, accompanied by 2 of his men. They came to the woman at night and said, 'Use your ritual pit to conjure up for me the one I tell you.' But the woman said to him, 'Look, you are aware of what Saul has done. He has removed the mediums and magicians from the land. Why are you trapping me, so you can put me to death?' But Saul swore an oath to her by the Lord, 'As surely as the Lord lives, you will not incur guilt in this matter.' The woman replied, 'Who is it that I should bring up for you?' He said, 'Bring up for me Samuel.' When the woman saw Samuel, she cried loudly. The woman said to Saul, 'Why have you deceived me? You are Saul.' The king said to her, 'Don't be afraid. What have you seen?' The woman replied to Saul, 'I have seen one like a god coming up from the ground.' He said to her, 'What about his appearance?' She said, 'An old man is coming up. He is wrapped in a robe.' Then Saul realized it was Samuel, and he bowed his face toward the ground and kneeled down. Samuel said to Saul, 'Why have you disturbed me in bringing me up?' Saul replied, 'I am terribly troubled. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He does not answer me, nor by the prophets, nor by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what I should do." End quote. It goes on after that. But a female conjurer in the Bible, using the power of God to communicate with spirits as a medium for Saul. Joe was using his hindsight to claim that her story made it into the Bible, therefore the power she wielded must have been the Spirit of God. But then Joe asks a relevant question. How would the people at the time have been able to unravel the mystery of whether or not this priestess was empowered by the Spirit of God? They didn't know that story was going to make it in the Bible. A skeptic needn't wrestle with such absurdities. Is Santa's sleigh powered by harnessed gravitational waves from Venus or by the souls of captured children from the naughty list? It doesn't matter. But for a person claiming to speak to and for God on earth, it's important that Joe was using white magic and using arguments from the Bible to, quote-unquote, try those spirits. Joe then takes the opportunity to look to sects outside of the Bible, to cast his aspersions at those sects led by the devil, of course. Mormon God is the only way to heaven. Anytime the conversation comes up that Mormonism doesn't tear down other religions, you can always point people to the claims that the first vision said that God and Jesus said that all the religions are evil and their professors are corrupt. But also, this epistle makes the point even more clear as to where Joseph stood on other religions. Quote, "There always did in every age seem to be a lack of intelligence pertaining to this subject. Spirits of all kinds have been manifested in every age, and almost amongst all people. If we go among the pagans, they have their spirits. The Mohammedans, the Jews, the Christians, the Indians, all have their spirits. All have a supernatural agency, and all contend that their spirits are of God. Who shall solve this mystery?" I bet it's Joe. It's got to be Joe, right? He's going to solve it for us. "Try the spirits," says John, "but who is to do it? The learned, the eloquent, the philosopher, the sage, the divine, all are ignorant." It's the prophets that know. "The heathens will boast of their gods and of the great things that have been unfolded by their oracles. The Mussulman," that's a person who believes in Islam, "will boast of his Quran and of the divine communications that his progenitors have received and are receiving. The Jews have had numerous instances, both ancient and modern, among them, of men who have professed to be inspired and sent to bring about great events, and the Christian world has not been slow in making up the number. Try the spirits. But by what? Are we to try them by the creeds of men? What a preposterous folly, a cobweb of yesterday. Angels would hide their faces, and devils would be ashamed and insulted, and would say, Paul, we know, and Jesus, we know, but who are ye? Let each man or society make a creed and try evil spirits by it, and the devil would shake his sides. It is all that he would ask, all that he would desire. Yet many of them do this, and hence many spirits are abroad in the world. It seems that Joseph's entire line of argumentation could be rendered moot by simply saying, but Joe, to be fair, just look in the mirror, man. You're doing exactly all of that. If you want to know how deluded Christianity is, ask a Muslim imam. If you want to know how delusional Islam is, ask a Jewish rabbi. It's a massive finger-pointing circle jerk of pots and kettles screaming at each other for not being truly black. And sure, if you grant that Joe had some kind of insight that no other human being has ever had on the entire planet, then this line of argumentation is internally consistent. But if you don't grant that special pleading to Joseph Smith and view him to be just similar to hundreds of other Christian sects of his day, his whole line of argumentation falls apart. He's making the case. He's the prophet. He knows how to discern good and evil spirits, but every other religion out there, they all are using the spirit of the devil. He continues on, quote, one great evil is that men are ignorant of the nature of spirits, their power, laws, government, intelligence, etc., and imagine that when there is anything like power, revelation, or vision manifested, that it must be of God. Hence, the Methodists, Presbyterians, and others frequently possess a spirit that will cause them to lay down, and during its operation, animation is frequently entirely suspended. Yeah, couch lock, we've all been there. They consider it to be the power of God, and a glorious manifestation from God. A manifestation of what? Is there any intelligence communicated? Are the curtains of heaven withdrawn, or the purposes of God developed? Have they seen and conversed with an angel, or have the glories of futurity burst upon their view? No, but their body has been inanimate, the operation of their spirit suspended, and all the intelligence that can be obtained from them when they arise is a shout of glory or hallelujah or some incoherent expression. But they had the power. End quote. Now, this is skirting dangerously close to being self-reflective on Joe's part. Once again, a person could say, well, Joe, isn't all of that exactly what the Mormons are doing? I mean, aren't Mormons doing everything that you just listed and also speaking in tongues and experiencing group hallucinations of angels after you feed them the Lord's Supper? The thing is, Joe digs in really deep here. And trust me, we're going somewhere with all of this when it comes to women in authority positions of religions. But just hang in there with me until the end for us to wrap this all together. We're throwing out a whole bunch of strings and we're going to tie them all back together by the end. He continues, quote, the shaker will whirl around on his heel, impelled by his supernatural agency or spirit, and think that he is governed by the Spirit of God. And the jumper will jump and enter into all kinds of extravagances. A primitive Methodist will shout under the influence of the Spirit until he will rend the heavens with his cries. While the Quakers, moved, as they think, by the Spirit of God, will sit still and say nothing. Is God the author of all of this? If not of all of it, which does he recognize? Surely such a heterogeneous mass of confusion never can enter into the kingdom of heaven. End quote. He almost got there, right? Joe almost got to the point of saying these religions all do stuff that we do. How can we know that our version of all these spiritual manifestations is the Spirit of God? But he doesn't quite get there. And after that, it just gets worse with Joe's lack of self-awareness. Quote, every one of these professes to be competent to try his neighbor's spirit, but no one can try his own. And what is the reason? I love that. This whole time he's saying everybody is saying that everyone else is led by the spirit of the devil, but not what we're doing. Because they have not a key to unlock, no rule wherewith to measure, and no criterion whereby they can test it. End quote. And there's a special pleading. They don't have the key to tell what the Spirit of God or Spirit of devil, only Joseph holds all the keys. He digs in so much deeper. Quote, could anyone tell the length, breadth, or height of a building without a rule, test the quality of metals without a criterion, or point out the movements of planetary systems without a knowledge of astronomy? Certainly not. And if such ignorance as this is manifested about a spirit of this kind, who can describe an angel of light? If Satan should appear as one in glory, who can tell his color? of his skin, his signs, his appearance, his glory, or what is the manner of his manifestations? Who can detect the spirit of the French prophets with their revelations and visions and power and manifestations? Or who can point out the spirit of the Irvingites with their apostles and prophets and visions and tongues and interpretations, etc., etc.? Or who can drag into daylight and develop the hidden mysteries of the false spirits that so frequently are made manifest among the Latter-day Saints? End quote. Oh, the false spirits, even among our own people. Who can detect? Who has that measuring stick? Who has the legend, the key by which we can tell what spirits are righteous and what are of the devil? What is this magic yardstick that we get to use to determine that Mormon Church is actually the only true religion led by God, while all of the other thousands, tens of thousands of religions on the planet are led by the devil? Spoiler alert, it's going to be the same litmus test as every Christian uses to test whether or not a spirit is of God, the Bible. But of course, because the Bible is such a massive, convoluted work of literature by dozens of authors, passages can be extracted from it to justify anything the reader sees fit. You want to justify owning people as property, physically abusing your wives, overthrowing the government, or rendering unto Caesar what's his, genocide against unbelievers, or really anything that you want, the Bible has your back. Joseph goes on, quote, "We answer that no man can do this without the priesthood." You know, of course, there's our key, the priesthood. That's how we tell. Earlier, he was making the argument from Paul, saying, test the spirits. That's the title of this epistle. But now he's saying it's the priesthood that we give you. No man can do this without the priesthood, and having a knowledge of the laws by which spirits are governed. For as, quote, "No man knows the things of God but by the Spirit of God," end quote, so no man knows the spirits of the devil and his power and influence, but by possessing intelligence which is more than human, and having unfolded through the medium of the priesthood the mysterious operations of his devices. Without knowing the angelic form, the sanctified look and gesture, and the zeal that is frequently manifested by him for the glory of God, together with the prophetic spirit, the gracious influence, the godly appearance, and the holy garb, which are so characteristic of his proceedings and his mysterious windings. End quote. So that was a lot of convoluted language, but this is hearkening heavily back to Joseph's initiation into Masonry, which happened 2 weeks before he gave this epistle. But that's it. I mean, the yardstick that Joseph is using to personally tell you whether or not you are being moved and led by the Spirit of God, that's the priesthood, which only Joseph or elders in the church, trusted Mormon elites, can give to you. And this, at its very basis, this is very coercive, right? This is how you tell everybody that the entire world is corrupt and on fire, but I'm not corrupt and I'm the only one with a fire extinguisher. And what's interesting, the next paragraph in this epistle is extremely prophetic when we reflect on 19th century Utah history, but it's not meant to be prophetic. It's really interesting. Quote, "A man must have the discerning of spirits before he can drag into daylight this hellish influence and unfold it unto the world in all its soul-destroying, diabolical, and horrid colors. For nothing is a greater injury to the children of men than to be under the influence of a false spirit when they think they have the Spirit of God. Thousands have felt the influence of its terrible power and baneful effects. Long pilgrimages have been undertaken, penances endured, and pain, misery, and ruin have followed in their train. Nations have been convulsed, kingdoms overthrown, provinces laid waste, and blood, carnage, and desolation are the habiliments in which it has been clothed." If only Joseph could see Brigham Young's rule in the Utah Territory. But of course he doesn't know what's going to happen to the Mormon Church after his death. "The Turks, the Hindus, the Jews, the Christians, the Indians, in fact, all nations have been deceived, imposed upon, and injured through the mischievous effects of false spirits." End quote. All of this coming from a man who was literally trying to build his own theocratic kingdom and overthrow the United States government, who had also backed down from a horrific battle in Missouri when he was outnumbered and surrounded by Missouri state militia forces. And, I mean, look, his logic is sound, right? Religion has been used to inflict complete and utter chaos, commit countless genocides, large and small, segregate people because of geography or skin color. But I have to ask, is the best solution to all of these religious issues really yet one more person claiming to have the one true religion? Isn't that kind of where all of this conflict starts? Oh well. After that, Joe goes on another 6-paragraph screed against the ancient false spirits, which I'm going to spare from you. He picks up with casting aspersions at modern religious groups. And of course, once again, when talking of modern religions, Joe is quick to trot out things that he does, but is not very self-reflective because he is, disparaging these practices. Quote, having said so much upon general principles without referring to the peculiar situation, power, and influence of the magicians of Egypt, the wizards and witches of the Jews, the oracles of the heathen, their necromancers, soothsayers, and astrologers. Yeah, we can't have those things. The maniacs or those possessed of devils in the apostles' days, we will notice and try to detect some few instances of the development of false spirits in more modern times and in this our day. The French prophets were possessed of a spirit that deceived. They existed in Vivarais and Dauphine in great numbers in the year 1688. There were many boys and girls from 7 to 25. They had strange fits, as in tremblings and faintings, which made them stretch out their legs and arms as in a swoon. They remained a while in trances, and coming out of them uttered all that came in their mouths. End quote. This paragraph is pretty interesting. Europe and France specifically during the Enlightenment was a hotbed of religious innovation. With the Protestant Reformation throughout the mid-1500s to the mid-1600s, Catholicism was losing a lot of control that they had exercised in the past when squashing out small religious uprisings in opposition to their iron fist. The Protestant Reformation may have kicked off in Germany, but France throughout the 16 and 1700s was where art, science, philosophy, religion, and especially occult sciences flourished with relative lack of restraint when compared to the previous more than 1,000 years of the medieval period. Most of the major schools of occult philosophy that Joe knew gained popularity during this time, even if the genesis of those curricula was actually before the 1600s. Hermeticism, Kabbalah, post-Enlightenment Gnosticism, alchemy, Masonry, all of those comprised Joe's understanding of the nature of God. From Joseph Smith and the Kabbalah by Lance Owens, beginning with a quote from Harold Bloom. This is particularly interesting. Quote, what is clear is that Smith and his apostles restated what Moshe Idel, our great living scholar of Kabbalah, persuades me was the archaic or original Jewish language. My observation certainly does find enormous validity in Smith's imaginative recapture of crucial elements evaded by normative Judaism and by the church after it. That's occult, of course. The God of Joseph Smith is a daring revival of the God of some of the Kabbalists and Gnostics, prophetic sages who, like Smith himself, asserted that they had returned to the true religion. Either there was a more direct Kabbalistic influence upon Smith than we know, or, far more likely, his genius reinvented Kabbalah in an effort necessary to restore archaic Judaism. Now, back to Lance Owens in his article, quote, while I would not diminish the inventive genius of Joseph Smith, careful reevaluation of historical data suggests there is both a poetic and an unsuspecting factual substance to Bloom's thesis. Though yet little understood, from Joseph's adolescent years forward, he had repeated, sometimes intimate and arguably influential associations with distant legacies of Gnosticism, conveyed by Kabbalah and Hermeticism. Traditions intertwined in the Renaissance and nurtured through the reformative religious aspirations of 3 subsequent centuries. Though any sympathy Joseph held for old heresy was perhaps intrinsic to his nature rather than bred by association, the associations did exist, and they hold a rich context of meanings. Of course, the relative import of these interactions in Joseph Smith's history will remain problematic for historians. Efforts to revision the prophet in their light or to reevaluate our methodology of understanding his history may evoke a violent response from traditionalists. Nonetheless, there is a substantial documentary evidence, material unexplored by Bloom or Mormon historians generally, supporting a much more direct Kabbalistic and Hermetic influences upon Joseph Smith and his doctrine of God than has previously been considered possible. Final paragraph. Through his associations with ceremonial magic as a young treasure seer, Smith contacted symbols and lore directly taken from Kabbalah. In his prophetic translation of sacred writ, his hermeneutic method was in nature Kabbalistic. With his initiation into Masonry, he entered a tradition born of the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition." End quote. So, given that context from Lance Owens, Joe casting aspersions at the quote-unquote French prophets really comes into focus when we know just how in touch he was with occult philosophies like Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and, Rosicrucian mysticism. Those, quote, "wizards and witches of the Jews, the oracles of the heathen, their necromancers, soothsayers, and astrologers, the maniacs, or those possessed of devils in the apostles' days," end quote. All of those needed to be delineated from Joe's version of all of those practices. How could one know that Mormon necromancy, prophecy, maniacal behavior, convulsions, and astrology were moved by the Spirit of God? If all of those things were practiced using the priesthood, of course. But let's bring this all back. Are women privy to that priesthood power to properly utilize these gifts? Joseph continues, quote, "Joanna Southcott professed to be a prophetess and wrote a book of prophecies in 1804. She became the founder of a people that are now extant. She was to bring forth in a place appointed a son that was to be the Messiah, which thing has failed. Independent of this, however, where do we read of a woman that was the founder of a church in the Word of God? Paul told women in his day, quote, to keep silence in the church, and that if they wished to know anything, to ask their husbands at home," end quote. He would not suffer a woman, quote, "to rule or to usurp authority in the church," end quote. But here we find a woman, the founder of a church, the revelator and guide, the Alpha and Omega, contrary to all acknowledged rule, principle, and order, end quote. So there's an intermingling of Joseph using the Bible as a test for the Spirit, in concert with his own priesthood powers and feelings that he has in his heart, his sincere religious beliefs, and the Bible he's using to say that women can never rule over men. That's contrary to all acknowledged rule, principle, and order. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting example. Joanna Southcott is quite a fascinating case study when we're talking about people who styled themselves prophets of the Lord in 19th century American history. Well, let's say turn of the 19th century. It was late 18th, early 19th century. So Southcott's first book of Revelations, circa January 1803, deals with men who would claim that women can't be prophets because of justifications written by Paul that Joe had just used. She says, quote, "Whereas the learned and self-righteous have condemned me for an impostor for saying the Lord saith, when they affirm he has not spoken, now let them bring forth their arguments and show their strong reasons, why they pretend to judge of a thing they know nothing about, and why they judge in the dark, when they were invited to judge in the daylight, and have the perfect truth laid before them." I love this. Joanna Southcott saying, hey, contend with me in real arguments here. Use it in daylight, just like Joseph Smith said. Okay, Southcott continues, "Let men capable of reason attend to reason. Should a man condemn the Bible who never read it through, forming his judgments upon a few pages of it and condemning the whole? Would you not be ready to condemn such a one? You would answer, yes. You are in duty bound to blame him, and I answer, I am duty bound to blame all men that condemn my writings, without coming to clear light, truth, and knowledge of them." End quote. Joanna Southcott wrote over 60 books. Now, if this is a little diversion, but if we judge a prophet by volume of work, she's about 9 billion times more of a prophet than Joseph Smith ever, just by sheer word count. But volume of publications does not a prophet make. The Lord actually spoke to Joanna Southcott in rhymes. She published thousands of pages of her communications with deity. Here's a sampling from June 1804. This is the book that Joseph is referring to specifically, which there were actually 12 books of prophecy that she wrote in 1804 alone. And this is when she was led to ponder her role as a woman in a male-dominated society of religious ministers and self-proclaimed prophets. Here's her nice little rhyme. Quote, "Now this hath been the pondering heart of thee, how thou wouldst act sooner than disobey. And from thy heart I'll now appear, and prove that men are devils here. And if they would have thee disobey, and let the serpent now to say, it is a fever of thy brain, that thou with men do thus contend, thy Maker's will for to obey. They all shall find the woman's free from the temptations of the fall, and from that guilt I tell you all, and so by her the serpent's cast. But now in man he strong does burst. So 'tis with man she must contend, because the devil's now in men, and like the serpent doth appear. End quote. That poem is actually like 15 pages long. It's I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you kind of get the idea here. And Joanna Southcott is actually a really interesting case. Let's just go through a brief history of her. She joined Wesleyan Methodism in 1792. Then soon after that, she claimed that she possessed supernatural gifts in communicating with spirits. She even sold special, quote, seals of the Lord, end quote, which were basically passports to become one of the 144,000 spoken of in Revelation that would get into heaven. So instead of taking tithing donations, it seems much more sustainable, monthly income donations, so on and so forth. Joanna Southcott literally sold people a way to get into heaven through these seals of the Lord. And they were anywhere from like just a few shillings to like a few dollars a piece. And then finally at age 64 in 1814, and this is when little Joseph was just 9 years old, Joanna Southcott claimed to be with child and that she would deliver the Messiah on a given date. And Joe actually alluded to that in the epistle passage that we just read. So Southcott literally thought that she would be the woman clothed in the sun with the moon under her feet with the crown of 12 stars who would fight it out with the dragon in the last days as spoken of in the book of Revelation. She was a restorationist prophetess. Right before her death, Southcott actually had a box made for the sealed portion of her unpublished revelations. And it's kind of interesting. The contents of this box are still disputed to this day by a few remnant families dotting the planet who still believe that Joanna Southcott was a prophetess, an apocalyptic prophetess. They still believe in, I guess you can call it Southcottism. And honestly, I have to say, the more that I looked into Southcott for this little segment, the more that I realized that somebody out there really needs to do a naked Southcottism or something. This is a wonderfully fascinating religious movement that boasted at one point to have over 100,000 followers in the early 1800s. Needless to say, Southcottists had a remarkable penchant for charismatic leaders, just like many of the Mormons. And that partially explains why Joe thought it was necessary to bring her up in this screed about women's roles in religion. Joe was happy to cite Paul's statement that women are to remain silent in church and ask their husbands for instructions once they're home. And sure, Joe may have been comparatively progressive with respect to some of his contemporaries, but really, when we look at his epistle here, Joseph Smith was a product of his time, and he couldn't supersede the prescribed social structures of his day. And of course, Southcott wasn't the only focus of Joe's derision. He continues in his epistle, quote, Jemima Wilkinson was another prophetess that figured largely in America in the last century. This is really fascinating. She stated that she was taken sick and died, and that her soul went to heaven where it still continues. Soon after, her body was reanimated with the spirit and power of Christ, upon which she set up as a public teacher and declared she had an immediate revelation. Now the scriptures positively assert that, quote, Christ is the first fruit. Afterwards, those that are Christ's at his coming, then cometh the end, end quote. But Jemima, according to her testimony, died and rose again before the time mentioned in the scriptures. The idea of her soul being in heaven while her body was on earth is also preposterous. Doesn't Joe teach that bodies and spirits are separate? There's a premortal existence and that we all get our bodies and then we leave our bodies when we die. Anyway, when God breathed into man's nostrils, he became a living soul. Before that, he did not live. That is interesting. That doesn't seem to comport with the premortal existence. And when that was taken away, his body died, and so did our Savior when the spirit left the body. Nor did his body live until his spirit returned in the power of his resurrection. But Mrs. Wilkinson's soul, life, was in heaven, and her body without the soul or life on earth, living without the soul or without life. End quote. Jemima Wilkinson is actually another really fascinating case in American religious history. At age 24, this is in 1776, Jemima Wilkinson was afflicted with typhoid fever, the same illness which hit the Smith family and resulted in Joe's leg operation at his youth. And that was nothing special. There were frequent bouts of typhoid throughout America all the time. I mean, Wilkinson's case is nothing particularly rare. But at the height of Wilkinson's illness, she had an out-of-body experience, to which Joe alluded when talking about her claim that her body and her spirit were separated and that her spirit continues to live in heaven and that she was resurrected. But when Wilkinson came back, they claimed that they were neither male nor female and that all are alike unto Christ, and thus kicked off their religious movement derived from the Quakers. Wilkinson's movement came to be known as the Universal Friends Society, and they began calling themselves the Public Universal Friend at the head of the society. Quakers, before the pejorative term of Quakers was applied to them, called themselves Friends. Their publications frequently included Friends in the title. Back in the Book of Abraham Logical Part 2, I actually cited the Friends Weekly Intelligencer when they went and met with Mother Lucy Mack Smith when she was talking about the translation process. So the Quakers were known as Friends before they were called the Quakers. And Wilkinson came from a Quaker society, a Friends society, which after their resurrection or this out-of-body sacred experience, they called themselves the Public Universal Friend, thus the Quaker derivation. However, upon Wilkinson's reinvention of character as a sexually ambiguous person, they actually offended the Quaker societies, and thus they were forced to create their own religious movement. Now, this is out of a book called A Queer History of the United States, written by Michael Bronski, and he tells of Wilkinson's increasing success on the preaching circuit throughout the 1780s and 90s. Quote, Mid-1780s, the popular press and pamphlet culture covered Wilkinson's sermons in detail and placed particular emphasis on their sexually ambiguous persona. Wilkinson had a huge following that verged on a cult and eventually started a religious settlement in central New York State. End quote. This Wilkinson's cult, would be one of the earliest communalistic cults that was included as part of the first Great Awakening area of New England, which enjoyed a renewed level of religiosity in the 1810s to 30s during the Second Great Awakening in the Burned-Over District. Now let's just take a second to pause here. Think of Jemima Wilkinson, this universal friend. Think of their struggle. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be a gender non-binary person at the turn of the 19th century in America? This Protestant, sexually uptight society trying to tell them what sexual ambiguity was like. I mean, they were executing women less than 100 years before this for epilepsy or drug overdose in the Salem witch trials. And today, more than 200 years later, people are executed all over their globe because their sexuality or their identity falls in the realm of the proscribed perversion of the status quo religion. Add into that being a public figure like Wilkinson was in a market led almost exclusively by men, the religious societies. I mean, you have to understand they received universal condemnation as prophet of the Universal Friends Society. Some interactions with Wilkinson are recorded by other preachers who shared discourse with them. It should be understandable that they was rather embittered by such public derision as a constant onslaught of their sexually ambiguous character. Paul Moyer has a very interesting book on Wilkinson and the Public Universal Friend religious movement. Moyer recounts some interactions and uses the masculine to describe Wilkinson here. Quote, "The Friends," that's Wilkinson, "the Friends community of the faithful soon proved to be all too exposed to the baleful influence of outsiders. Methodist circuit preacher Thomas Smith demonstrated this in 1806 when he held an outdoor meeting in Jerusalem near the prophet's home. According to Smith, he spoke to a large crowd while the Universal Friend observed from a distance." Universal Friend is Wilkinson. "The preacher directly challenged the Comforter's identity as a holy messenger, taking as his text Revelation chapter 2, verse 20. Now quoting the Bible, quote, "Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols." End quote. Back to Moyer. Who Smith considered Jezebel was clear to everyone. When some of the Friend's adherents reported what he had said to their leader, Smith recalled that, quote, "she wept and then put the black mark of reprobation on me." Itinerant preachers were not the only visitors to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was what the name of the Universal Friends Society, their communalistic enclave, was called, Jerusalem. And by the 19th century, tourists on their way to see Niagara Falls frequently made an excursion to see the Universal Friend. Several of these travelers published accounts that gives the impression of a prophet whose charismatic powers were clearly on the wane. In 1810, a man who simply signed his narrative T.C. described the Holy Messenger as a corpulent woman, masculine-featured, her hair nearly gray, combed back, her age 59. Neither her tone of voice nor manner bespoke much intercourse with the world, and nothing with the polite part of it. After talking with the prophet about his religious views, the visitor took his leave, having found the Friend's conversation, quote, "unpleasantly paranetic and didactic, abounding with scripture phraseology applied somewhat at random, and strongly savoring of what seemed to me affected mysticism," end quote. Similarly, an anonymous traveler report from 1812 describes the comforter as selfish, tyrannical, and overbearing, and his followers as weak in intellect and inclined to superstitions. Does anybody see some possible parallelisms in Mormonism and Joseph Smith? Anyway, the writer also foresaw the sex decline, asserting that it did not exceed 100 in number, and predicting, quote, "the submission which they made to the Friend will not probably be imitated by their children." It would be easy to pass off these observations as uninformed opinions that do not accurately portray the Universal Friend or his society. Yet there is more than a kernel of truth to them. The prophet was aging and losing energy and comeliness of youth that had served him so well in the early years of his ministry. After the move to New York frontier, the Friend also lost access to large numbers of potential converts in the thickly settled East. Worse yet, the followers had already began to fall away. The primary source of trouble, however, was a rebellion against the prophet's rule by defecting members of his sect. Interesting. These rebels challenged the Universal Friend's claim to divine status and focused their attacks on his earthly basis of power. End quote. Do you see any possible parallels in Mormonism? Constant disaffections, charismatic power waning in later years. I have to admit, seeing Wilkinson's trajectory and everything that they suffered, it's maybe Joe died at his height. You know, he died before he became the villain. He was still the hero in the Mormons' eyes. Brigham Young just kind of took that and ran with it. And so that whole passage was from Moyer, The Public Universal Friend, page 166 through 67. You're going to find the link into the show notes if you want to read that. The whole book is uploaded and archived online if you want to read it there. Needless to say, women and genderqueer religious people were universally decried by their male counterparts. And really, there's plenty of religious justification for these declarations. You know, that stems from Paul in the Bible, and Joe was happy to quote Paul in his epistle discussing women's role in the church. So if we're going to try and you know, dovetail off of these two female religious prophetesses, the examples that Joseph provided for us, let's try and jump back into his epistle. But I hope that provides some context, right? This epistle was presented to the first women's leadership quorum in the Mormon Church a mere 2 weeks after it was founded. It wasn't really understood what the central role of the Relief Society was, and obviously those conversations were happening. It just took Joe coming in and setting down the rules through this epistle for them to, the women there, to understand what their roles were. And presumably, and he actually goes on to continue to deride the practices of speaking in tongues used by women in these various religions that are led by women. And presumably that's because the women in these groups speaking in tongues wasn't as pleasing to his ears as Zina Huntington, Sarah Whitney, and Emma Smith speaking in tongues were. There's no way to know because speaking in tongues were frequently happening in the church. But when Joseph talks about these other groups speaking in tongues, he's not too pleased. Here we go. Quote, "They there were honored as the prophetesses of God, and when the women spoke in tongues, Mr. Irving or any of his ministers had to keep silence. They were peculiarly wrought upon before the congregation and had strange utterances, uttered in an unnatural, shrill voice and with thrilling intonations. They frequently made use of a few broken, unconnected sentences that were ambiguous, incoherent, and incomprehensible." Oh, so glossolalia is hard to understand, really, Joe? Really? At other times, they were more clearly understood. They would frequently cry out, "There is iniquity! There is iniquity!" And Mr. Irving has been led, under the influence of this charge, to fall down upon his knees before the public congregations and to confess his sin, not knowing whether he had sinned, nor whether the thing referred to him or somebody else. All right, so these women speaking in tongues, then they yell, "There's iniquity, there's iniquity," and Mr. Irving thinks that they're talking about him. So these women, these prophetesses, are speaking in tongues, calling Mr. Irving to repent, and he falls down on his knees, not knowing whether he's the one who has sinned or it was somebody else. So we have women in this society policing the conduct of men. We surely can't have that now, can we? During these operations, the bodies of the persons speaking were powerfully wrought upon. Their countenances were distorted. They had frequent twitchings in their hands, and their whole system was powerfully convulsed at intervals. They sometimes, however, it is supposed, spoke in correct tongues and had true interpretations. So everything they say is horrible, except sometimes they get a correct word, peppered in there. It's glossolalia. Like it's nonsense every single time. And I have to say, this is also really fascinating to me just because Joe described the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony, right? I mean, all of these things that he just described happened in Kirtland at some point, except for the women calling the men to repentance. We can't have that. And I have to say, I suppose this is one of the major takeaways of this entire epistle, right? If you're not doing all of these religious practices while you're calling yourself a Mormon, you're led by the devil. But if you're experiencing tongues and spiritual ecstasy, seemingly epileptic fits or, whatever you're experiencing or, seeing spirits and angels or God, if you're doing those as a Mormon, then it's okay. You're led by the Spirit of God. That's how you test the Spirit, whether or not your name is on the Mormon roll book. He continues, quote, "Under the influence of this Spirit, the church was organized by these women. Apostles, prophet, etc. were soon called, and a systemic order of things introduced, as above mentioned. A Mr. Baxter, upon going into one of these meetings, says, quote, 'I saw power manifested, and thought it was the power of God, and asked that it might fall upon me. It did so, and I began to prophesy,' end quote." Isn't that interesting? You have somebody who goes into a religion and says, "I want the Spirit of God to fall upon me," and then they begin to prophesy. I assume prophesy means speaking in tongues specifically in this regard. Therefore, it's true. It's true to Mr. Baxter. That's the Spirit of God, according to Mr. Baxter. But according to Joe, his opinion is the one that matters here. That's a spirit of the devil. He continues talking about this, Mr. Baxter. 8 or 9 years ago, they had about 60 preachers going through the streets of London, testifying that London was to be the place where the two witnesses spoken of by John were to prophesy, that they, meaning the church, and the Spirit were the witnesses, and that at the end of 3 years and a half, there was to be an earthquake and great destruction, and our Savior was to come. Apocalyptic prophecies. Great stuff. Their apostles were called together at the appointed time, watching the event, but Jesus did not come, and the prophecy was then ambiguously explained away. End quote. This is fun because we have one prophet saying everybody else are false prophets because they make prophecies and the prophecies were not fulfilled. Therefore, they are false prophets. But I have to say, Joseph was actually relatively smart when it came to his prophecies. If you just Google end of days prophecies and see how many thousands of results you get for just the last 8 years, you can see that end of days and second coming prophecies happen all the time. They're claimed by thousands of people across the globe every day, and none of them have ever actually come to pass. But Joe was calculated in most of his prophecies that were testable. For example, he prophesied that there would be an uprising that would happen in South Carolina. He prophesied that 3 witnesses would behold the plates, and he saw to it that that prophecy was fulfilled. He prophesied of Zion being in Missouri, and we'll have to wait until the second coming to see if that one holds up, but he didn't put a timestamp on it, so, he did in a separate prophecy, but we'll talk about that later. He also prophesied of the United Order, the Mormon communalism, and that failed every single time it was tried in Ohio, in Illinois, in Utah. It never worked. But simply by virtue of trying, I suppose that prophecy was sort of fulfilled. Apparently, Joe also claimed that none of the leadership's lives would be taken while they were in captivity in Liberty Jail. But, that did hold true, but scores of Mormons outside of the jail lost their lives due to sickness and starvation during the Exodus. So I guess we can call that a halfway fulfilled revelation. Joseph also prophesied that he would never step foot back in Missouri alive or dead. And, that was true. And obviously that was kind of up to his power to make that prophecy come true. He didn't want to get arrested again. So all of these prophecies that he gave are either vague enough or within Joseph's own control that the prophecy couldn't help but come true. And Mormons are happy to ignore the mountain of other prophecies which never came to pass. But it's worth noting that Joe was relatively careful with his prophecies. Now, I would contend that Joe learned his lesson when he saw so many charismatic doomsday revivalist cults fall to pieces after those doomsday prophecies failed. Therefore, he used more vague and calculated language to issue his prophecies. Even back to the Wood Scrape, the Nathaniel Wood cult that his dad and Oliver Cowdery's dad were a part of back in 1798-99. It prophesied of a doomsday, and the Vermont militia were called out to put the revival down. These apocalyptic revival cults happen all the time. I think Joe was just using those as examples and learning from them. Some other time, we're going to have to go through Joe's failed prophecies because one could argue that his failed prophecies are far more prolific than any prophecies that he gave that could be interpreted as having come true. But the point is, Joe was a charismatic prophet with decades of fulfilling leadership roles. Prior to Mormonism, he was the seer of a treasure-digging troop. After April 1830, he was the seer of a different kind of treasure-digging troop. He is quick to point out the flaws of Mr. Baxter and Irving in the next passage from the epistle. Apparently, these men that Joe provides as examples were failed prophets in that Baxter had called a false doomsday, and also he couldn't heal a child by the power of God, and the child died in his arms. So yes, according to Joe, Baxter and Irving's tragic flaws here have to do with them putting women in leadership roles of their church. Quote, "It may be asked, where is there anything in all this that is wrong? First, the church was organized by women, and, quote, God placed in the church first apostles, secondarily prophets, end quote, and not first women. But Mr. Irving placed in his church first women, secondarily apostles, and the church was founded and organized by them. A woman has no right to found or organize a church. God never sent them to do it. Second, those women who would speak in the midst of a meeting and rebuke Mr. Irving or any of the church. Now the scripture positively says, 'Thou shalt not rebuke an elder, but entreat him as a father.' Not only this, but they frequently accused the brethren, thus placing themselves in the seat of Satan, who is emphatically called the accuser of the brethren." End quote. That's the problem. Women as the leadership roles. A woman has no right to found or organize a church. God never sent them to do that. That's not their job. And the women frequently accusing the brethren. Those are the tragic flaws of Mr. Irving and Baxter. The last 2 points after that, he proposes 4 points, but the last 2 points after first and second claim that those guys didn't get baptized and confirmed into Mormonism, and they don't follow Joseph Smith, therefore they can't possibly be a true prophet like the Mormons were. There was a subtle allusion in there about the women rebuking Mr. Irving, and we're going to get to that in a moment after we wrap up the epistle, because that is an important detail in this Relief Society meeting in which this epistle was presented. Remember, Joe had made some bold assertions that the entire reason behind the false spirits being manifested in other religious sects was due to women being put in leadership roles over men. He concludes his epistle by invoking jurisprudence of the church court when false spirits and people claiming to speak for God have come forward. He begins with an unnamed woman who gave a revelation which didn't come true. The last paragraph, I feel, really sums everything up really well. Given the content of the epistle and the fact that this whole epistle was given only to the Female Relief Society in Nauvoo, these concluding thoughts he gives seem to be more of an ultimatum than just idle reminiscing. Quote, "We have also had brethren and sisters who have written revelations and have started forward to lead this church. Such was a young boy in Kirtland, Isaac Russell of Missouri, and Gladden Bishop and Oliver Olney of Nauvoo. The boy is now living with his parents who have submitted to the laws of the church." Don't disobey authority. "Mr. Russell stayed in Far West, from whence he was to go to the Rocky Mountains, led by 3 Nephites, but the Nephites never came. His friends forsook him, all but some of his blood relations, who have since been nearly destroyed by the mob." Don't leave the flock, or your friends and family will leave you, and the mob will destroy you. "Mr. Bishop was tried by the High Council, his papers examined, condemned, and burned, and he cut off from the church." Wow. Don't you dare claim to be receiving prophecy, or the same fate awaits, right? Right? That's what it sounds like. It seems to be right within the context. And I think the next line sums it up perfectly. "He," meaning Bishop, "acknowledged the justice of the decision and said that he now saw his error, for if he had been governed by the revelations given before, he might have known that no man was to write revelations for the church but," you guessed it, "Joseph Smith, and begged to be prayed for and forgiven by the brethren." There you go. No man can write revelations for the church but Joseph Smith. And certainly no women. No, God, no, we can't have that happen. "And we'll allow you to come back to the church if you just submit to my authority and mine alone." Joseph is the guy giving this epistle in front of the Relief Society. He also concludes, "Mr. Olney has also been tried by the High Council and disfellowshipped, because he would not have his writings tested by the word of God, evidently proving that he loves darkness rather than light, because his deeds are evil." End quote. Yeah. That's what happens if you go against the priesthood. Now, to provide context for the remainder of this Relief Society meeting, we need to understand that rumors were really starting to become a problem in Nauvoo. And also, remember when Joe was deriding the fact that Mr. Irving was being chastised by the women of his society. Joe was exercising polygamy. He was acquiring more wives by the month. But it wasn't just him. Brigham Young had propositioned Martha Brotherton by locking her in a room with him and coercing her. John C. Reckitt Bennett was running around town with his spiritual wifery, which were relationships not approved of by Joe. There were a number of other Mormon elites who were working to acquire wives, who were actively courting other women. Rumors inevitably spread from all this drama and scandal. So after reading this epistle, Joe dismissed himself from the meeting. Emma Smith took the pulpit, the elect lady, and spoke of some scandalous rumors surrounding a woman named Clarissa Marvel. Clarissa Marvel was living with Agnes Moulton Coolbrith Smith, who was the widow of Joe's younger brother, Don Carlos, and had married Joe 3 months prior to this meeting. It seems as if her rumors, Clarissa Marvel's rumors, may have had something to do with Joe and Agnes Moulton Coolbrith. Referring to the first meeting of the Relief Society when it was organized, Avery and Newell write of the purposes of the Relief Society in Mormon Enigma, and this is beginning on page 108. Quote, "Emma and Joseph together outlined the purposes of the society, which were to, quote, provoke the brethren to do good works, to save the elder the trouble of rebuking." So to have a female legislative body essentially in the church, or judicial body, it sounds more like, to look after the wants of the poor, to do good, and to deal frankly with each other. and adding into that, to correct the morals of the community. There would be no arguments about doing good and caring for the poor, but women dealing frankly with each other and correcting the morals of the community would become explosive issues in the city of Nauvoo. Now, continuing on, in page 111, I believe it is, quote, Emma reported that a young woman, Clarissa Marvel, quote, was accused of telling scandalous falsehoods of the character of President Joseph Smith without the least provocation, and asked that they would, in wisdom, adopt some plan to bring her to repentance. She continued, I presume that most of you know more about Clarissa Marvel than I. There must have been silent consternation among a few in the group who were privy to the teachings of celestial marriage. Joseph's plural wife, Louisa Beeman, sat in the meeting, as did Sarah Peake Noon and Violet Kimball. Did Emma know that her husband had approached some women and asked them to become his plural wives? Agnes Coolbrith Smith, Don Carlos's widow, came to the accused girl's defense, apparently unaware that gossip linked her own name to Joseph's. Clarissa Marvel lived with me nearly a year, and I saw nothing amiss of her, she reported. End quote. This issue was only just beginning. The rumors, the whispers, the hushed, quieted, and turning your back when you make eye contact. It wouldn't be for another few weeks before this specific instance with Clarissa Marvel was wrapped up, during which it was made abundantly clear that the Relief Society isn't just a 2-hour gossip session every week, but had a much loftier goal, like silencing those who would spread such scandalous fake news about the one true prophet. At the Relief Society meeting in mid-April, Emma took the pulpit again and read another epistle trying to stifle such rumors. This is from Mormon Enigma, page 111. Quote, Before adjourning the meeting, Emma read a document that Joseph and the church leaders had prepared for the Relief Society in March. It stated that some men were approaching women to, quote, deceive and debauch the innocent, end quote, saying that they had authority from Joseph or other church leaders. Now quoting the epistle. We have been informed that some unprincipled men have been guilty of such crimes. We do not mention their names, not knowing but what there may be some among you who are not sufficiently skilled in masonry to keep a secret. Let this epistle be had as a private matter in your society, and then we shall learn whether you are good masons. End quote. Are you skilled enough a mason to keep a secret? So what was the purpose of the Relief Society? What was the real purpose? We can't truly know. We can use markers like this, and we can surmise to some extent that it was created to slow down the Nauvoo rumor mill, but instead it seemed to create a petri dish where those rumors could abound without limitation, staffed by plural wives. It's abundantly clear that Joe never sought to allow the Relief Society any real executive authority. He provided plenty of examples of religions led by women who were in error, and he used the Bible to make his arguments that women have no executive authority. Women should stay silent in the church. Joseph was no different than his contemporaries in that regard. Did the women of the Relief Society have some kind of priesthood? Yes. They performed many of the ordinances that the men holding the priesthood did, but they didn't have any tangible power when it came to executive decisions and the deliberation leading to those decisions within the church. So what powers did they actually have? Was their priesthood separate but equal? I would argue that it was not separate or ever intended to be equal, but they did exercise some kind of priesthood in Nauvoo, some kind of priestesshood. Now, one significant takeaway from all this content is that early Mormonism is distinctly a product of its time. It wasn't some ancient religion initially created by Jesus and then restored through Joseph Smith. Mormonism is a 19th century American religion and suffered from all the same limitations and dicta of the society and culture from whence it sprang. Anybody making an argument to the contrary has ulterior motives for doing so. Joe may have been progressive for his day in some regards, but he was still a product of his time. If he were magically transported to our society today, he'd seem incredibly backwards and bigoted by today's standards. He may even be elected president. Joe Smith 2020, who's with me? Let's make America a theocracy again. That's going to do it for our episode today. A couple of exciting updates. Sunstone is coming up. It's the last weekend in July 2018 in Salt Lake City. Marie and I are presenting D&C cover to cover, Insider and Outsider. Marie and I are nearly done reading through the Doctrine and Covenants from cover to cover. And of course, I'm the insider, she's the outsider. So yeah, you get it. You see it. See why we titled it D&C cover, whatever. We're going to be presenting at Sunstone Symposium Saturday, July 28th, 2018. Our time slot is currently 10:15 in room 200C. Now, Sunstone this year has actually outgrown the University of Utah venue where it's been hosted for a long time. And now it's at the Mountain America Expo Center in Sandy, which has tons of parking and quick access to the track station just across the street. Sunstone is an awesome Mormon conference, 3 days long, last weekend in July. And it's just a wonderful interweaving of all kinds of different sects of Mormonism all coming together, people who are believers, unbelievers, talking about Mormonism. It's where I go to recharge my Mormon batteries, and the history lectures are absolutely incredible, and that's what Sunstone was initially created for. So that's what Sunstone is. Sunstone, it's an awesome conference. If you can make it for the whole conference or even just for the presentation that Marie and I are giving, it'd be really cool to see you there. I'd love to shake your hand and meet you and put a face to a name if I've ever interacted with you on social media and whatnot. But never fear, if you can't make it to Sunstone that Saturday morning, but that Friday night of the 27th of July is open, we're actually doing a live hangout at Squatters Pub. Now, Marie and I, last year, we did a live show at Squatters, and that was on the second floor of Squatters Pub. We're doing the same thing this year. We have something special for you guys. Squatters Pub is at 147 Broadway in downtown Salt Lake City. It's also right on the tracks line, just in case you don't have a designated driver. So just to let everybody know, we have to pay the staff and the venue. So we're doing a $5 door charge. It's really not that much. And then we're just going to ask everybody to be extremely generous to their servers so it doesn't cost Marie and I money to do the show. Like it did last year, we try and do things that don't cost us money in creating this content. So if you are able to attend July 27th at Squatters Pub, we're kicking it off at 8 p.m. So that'll give everybody plenty of time to get there from the last session of Sunstone and grab a bite to eat before the show starts. The show itself should run around an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and then we're just going to be mingling there Friday night until everybody calls it a night. And we're also super excited to have a super special guest join us for the live show. Stay tuned in the coming weeks to hear more details. And I'm going to keep bugging you guys about it for the next month until Sunstone and sharing updates as they come together. If you don't have your tickets for Sunstone yet, get them, sunstonemagazine.com. Or if you can't make it to Sunstone on Saturday morning, come to Squatters Friday night, July 27th. Come hang out with us. It's going to be a lot of fun. Really looking forward to it. With that, let's go ahead and close it up for the night. We do have a couple of new patrons. Looks like we have Nathan and Jake, Paul and Kaiser and Garrett. My goodness, a whole bunch of new patrons. Thank you all so much for pledging to support at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. It is your hard-earned dollars that go to supporting the creation and the research that goes into this show and making it so the presentations that are coming up here in July are going to go seamlessly. Fingers crossed. One more announcement that I wanted to make everybody aware of. If you are in the Seattle area by any chance, I'm going to be giving a presentation for the Seattle Atheists that's being organized on July 14th. I'm going to be telling you guys the details of that when I get the venue details coming up in the coming weeks. But just to let you know, the title of that talk is going to be By His Own Hand, the Best Worst Mormon Scripture. It's going to be a video or a slideshow presentation about some of the funniest fails when it comes to the Book of Abraham. In case you haven't had enough of the Book of Abraham and you're in the Seattle area, it'd be really cool to see you on July 14th, and I'll give you the venue details next week. That's going to do it for everything for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.